I'm so glad that you are here. Thanks for joining me today. My name is Abby. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told, and here's what I know. When we start paying attention to how we are communicating and what kinds of stories we're telling, then we have the opportunity to make different choices about that communicating and tell different stories. Everything we do communicates something, right? So when we look at our communication, we can look at the world we're creating and ask ourselves how we can make it better. Part of this is being in conversation with people. Today, our conversation partner is Michelle Colpean. She's a communication professor at the University of Cincinnati, the mom of Sami and Salma, and according to her and her Instagram bio, a semi-professional sad person. At this point, I want to say that this is a very open and honest conversation about Michelle's experience with child loss. I invite you to lean into this conversation with us, and I hope you feel safe to do so, even if it feels uncomfortable or unfamiliar. I hope that you can explore those feelings and ask some questions of yourself and learn some things with us today. The questions I encourage you to keep in mind during this conversation are, what are you feeling and why does this conversation make you feel that way? What story are you carrying around grief and does it still serve you? And how can you lean into a more complex understanding of grief? This conversation isn't really about tips and tricks or advice to surviving grief. It's just us getting to hear Michelle's story, her own experience, and the things she thinks about. I know I've talked a lot about the importance of the receivers of stories being the ones to create the space for that safe story sharing, so I hope we can enter into this, to me, almost sacred and certainly very human conversation together with that in mind. Remember, it is an honor to hear anyone's story, and I am especially grateful for Michelle's today. So take a deep breath with me, and let's begin. Hi, Michelle. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Sure, Abby. Thanks for having me.
I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. And to give a little overview for the people, I think this conversation's really going to revolve around grief, loss, inexplicable loss, and especially around the loss of a child, which is something that you've experienced. And I think this is going to be, hopefully a conversation where we can add some depth of understanding and meaning around those topics for people by looking at it from the lens of communication. Because to me, looking at anything through the lens of communication adds some really meaningful layers. And so I'm hoping this conversation can be the same. That being said, I'd love for you to introduce yourself so that people can get to know you before we jump into this conversation. And specifically, I think we know what the topic of our conversation is going to be. And based on the language I know you use around it, it is a part of your identity. It's obviously a huge part of your life, but it's not everything that's ever happened to you in your life. So I'd love to ask, in addition to your identity as a bereaved parent, what other roles and relationships define you in your life?
I guess if I'm thinking about how I think through my own identity, parenthood feels the most salient, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm not only a bereaved parent, I lost my son, Sami, in January 2021, but I'm also the parent of a surviving child, my daughter, Salma, who was born almost a year ago now. She's 11 months old today.
Aww.
So after we lost Sami, it's a balance to go from parent to bereaved parent to parent again. Mm. So that's always at the forefront, right? But of course, we have lots of other identities too. I'm a partner to my spouse. I'm a professor at the University of Cincinnati, where I'm an assistant educator professor, and I run our online degree program. So communication is a huge part of my life, what I teach, what I've dedicated my life to studying. So this feels like a really fitting context to sort of process some of my other life experiences. I'm not a good compartmentalizer. So everything always feels very woven together in my life. I don't do the professor thing and then I do the mom thing and the loss thing. It's all always happening at once for me. So I think those are the big ones. I mean, my Instagram bio says Comprof, Sami and Salma's mom, semi-professional sad person.
So, those are the big roles, yeah.
Yeah, I think It's maybe glib to talk about social media bios as reflecting our identity, but they do, right?
Yeah. Yes.
We write them that way for a reason. So
yep.
The more I think about it, those are probably the big three: mom, professor, sad person.
Yeah. I think I see my life in a similar way if I'm not a compartmentalizing person, is that there is just overlap across the board. And I think that makes my experience or understanding of things probably richer because like I know where this conversation is going to go is that your experience as someone in the field of comm does inform your life as a parent. Like for me, I'm like that informs how I am in all my other relationships and how I show up in a lot of different contexts. How'd you first get into communication?
By joining the speech team. So my undergrad degree is in psychological science. I'm a first generation college student. So
awesome.
I knew I wanted to go to college, but I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I knew I was interested in people, but I didn't know how. So I think I started my undergrad with a psychology major and maybe a business minor or something that seems absurd in hindsight because that's so not what I do or am interested in. But eventually I joined the speech team on a whim because my roommate dragged me. And how could you not fall in love with the comm department at Ball State University? So eventually the coaching staff said, "You're getting a master's degree, right?" And I said, "Sure." They go, "Okay, let's work on your grad school application." And I said, "Sure, what's grad school?" On board before I knew what I was getting myself into. And as someone who's always liked school, went on to get a Ph.D. at the University of Iowa and landed in Cincinnati as the trailing spouse for my partner, who's a physician at Cincinnati Children's, and was lucky enough to eventually find a position at the University of Cincinnati.
That's awesome. Yeah, I guess I'll go ahead and say that. Yeah, our connection is both being alumni of the Ball State speech team, and my experience was so similar. That I joined the speech team and I had started as a political science major. And then I just thought, oh, the people here are the worst. And they said, well, why don't you check out the comm department? And the people there are the best. And so it was the right thing for sure.
I definitely agree. I don't think there's a lot of like little kids that are like, when I grow up, I want to be a communication professor.
Yeah.
Which I think makes all of our origin stories interesting, right? There's a very specific set of reasons that led us here.
Yeah. And for me, like so many more reasons why I stayed in that world and why I still am in this world. Because it's just, I just think it adds a lot of value to my life to be able to learn all of this because I loved having classes and then immediately turning around and being like using what I learned in my classes in my actual life to make my life better.
Yeah, I think it's a blessing and a curse to all of those around us as meticulously analyze and apply theory to every interpersonal interaction in our life.
So you find yourself doing that too?
Of course.
Good.
That's why we're here doing this, right?
Yeah. One of the core parts of the CMM theory is that, we're shaping the social world and it's shaping us back. And I see this conversation is hopefully exemplifying that of sharing your story. And even in all the things within your story, you're going out and shaping your social world. And then the social world you're creating is coming back and shaping you in ways that maybe, you could talk about more, but maybe bringing comfort, maybe bringing peace, maybe bringing, connection with other people that have gone through the same experiences. And so I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation, going out into the social world that we're all a part of and making it, better, so to speak. Please tell me more about Sami.
Yeah, I would love to. So Sami is our pandemic baby. He was born in May 2020. So the world was still in peak pandemic lockdown, which is obviously stressful timing and circumstances for a lot of reasons, but in hindsight meant a lot more time together. So there's little to no help. My parents are a few hours away, nowhere to go. So unless Faris was at work, we were all always together. So lots and lots of time, which is hard, but also good. Definitely hard. Never really a sleep through the night baby or a sleep at all baby. Which at the time is maddening, right? There's a reason there's like a whole hustle culture around baby sleep online. But after we lost him, I thought about all the extra hours we had together in the middle of the night, which is maybe not the ideal hour for bonding, but it's still hours and hours and hours and hours of time that we had together that we wouldn't have had if he was asleep through the night, baby. So there's all sorts of, I think, perspective shift that happens after a loss. And with the baby, it's interesting, right? Because they don't have this whole lifespan to talk about their accomplishments and who they are, but they still have little personalities. And we lost Sami when he was 8 months old, and they're really starting to become little people instead of just cute potato blobs at that point.
Yeah.
But from the start, he was pretty alert and aware. We'd turn the pages of his books for him, and he'd go, It all made He was
thoughtful baby.
Yeah. My baby academic. Very thoughtful. His sister just whips through the pages as fast as she can. So we see the personality differences. Once he could move, he was a super happy kid, colicky when he was smaller. But once he had some bodily autonomy, he really blossomed. I swear he had developed comedic timing for a baby. Everyone thinks their kids are funny, but I'd ask him to say, Mama, and he'd wait a beat and go, Dada. And then he'd start laughing like he knew it was funny. So I think he would have really loved getting bigger and more mobile and trying new things and going places. So we never really got out much. It wasn't safe to go anywhere. But we'd take walks or go to an outdoor concert in our neighborhood, or his grandparents would quarantine for 2 weeks or whatever we were doing back then, just in order to come visit him for the weekend. So he loved being out and looking at people whenever we could. It's probably really fun when you only ever stare at your two parents all day.
Something new.
But, yeah, whenever we'd venture out a little bit, he really liked it. So I was going back to teaching part-time. We had a part-time nanny share set up at a good friend's house with a baby almost the same age. And so the first week we set that up, I stayed with him while he got used to it. But the next week I was going to leave and go back home to work a little bit for the first time. And then the first hour of the first time I ever left him alone in his 8 months of life, I got a call that he stopped breathing. And by the time I got to the hospital, which is the same hospital where my husband had been working upstairs, so he just came downstairs, Sami was gone, which maybe it's superstition, but I don't know. The timing is just too weird.
Right.
That he's ridiculously healthy for 8 months, and then the first hour I'm ever away from him in his life, he's gone. So I mean, no fault of the care he was in. They did everything right and then some. But I think maybe he knew his time was up and was just waiting for the first moment I wasn't around to witness it. Because how else do you explain that, right? If we're talking about the stories we tell ourselves to understand our reality or make meaning, I guess that's the one I've crafted around that.
Yeah.
Otherwise, the timing's just too strange.
Yeah. The meaning making is really interesting because, yeah, like you said, you didn't have an answer at the time. You don't have any answers now. And so I think it's a great example of, yeah, we make the meaning. And so you kind of, maybe look around and say, well, what meaning am I going to attach to this? And I don't know, how you kind of go about that process, if it's what meaning brings me the most peace of mind or what.
I think we have to retain some semblance of sanity. And I really mean sanity in like a legitimate clinical sense, right? Because this is enough to really make you lose your mind. I think there's a reason why folks who have lost children are so, not just plagued by depression and anxiety and PTSD, all of which I've been diagnosed with after Sami's loss clinically, but other things I've also been fortunate enough to avoid: addiction and pretty severe agoraphobia. And I get why that happens to people, and it ruins their lives and health and relationship. So I think anything to pull us out of it. And I know lots of folks who attach particular symbols and view them as signals for their lost loved ones. I don't think that's unique to baby loss. But I have a friend who sunflowers remind her of her son. I have another friend who sees dragonflies, and that reminds her of someone she's lost. All those sort of sources of meaning we look for that make us feel like our loved one is still present, I think are another way that sort of meaning making happens, where we're looking to craft narrative and feel a little less alone. And I think those can be really powerful for people.
Yeah.
I definitely have become more, I guess you could call it superstitious, since I've experienced a loss, and I know a lot of other people who feel that way as well.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a favorite memory from your time with Sami?
Oh, it's so hard, right? Memory is a weird thing because there's no like big trip we ever took because we didn't leave our house. I don't want to call them all. They're all sort of quotidian in a really comforting way. A lot of routine of just being in our house together as a family rather than like specific things we went out and did. One day that was really fun was when Sami was small, probably 5 or 6 months. We went to our town's village green, and they have live music playing, and everyone could social distance and spread out a bit outside. And we got ice cream from the ice cream shop, and we're letting our 5-month-old eat ice cream because he had so few like normal childhood baby joys. He can't go to story time. He can't play with other kids. So we let the 5-month-old lick the ice cream cone. My husband's a pediatrician. He's literally a neonatologist. So if he signed off on it, I'm like, okay, the baby gets ice cream. But those sort of irrational parenting decisions, in hindsight, we're like, I'm so glad our kid got to taste ice cream. Like, who says that's going to screw him up for life? Who cares?
Yeah, he got to experience ice cream.
Yeah, he got to sit in a park and listen to a concert and eat an ice cream cone, and what kid wouldn't like that? So little things like that wouldn't be a core memory necessarily for a lot of folks are all you have.
Right. Yeah, it's not that something extraordinary has to happen for the time that you had to mean something.
Yeah, the little things are extraordinary in their own right, I think.
Yeah, well, maybe that is part of that storytelling, is that when I ask that, or maybe other people have asked you that question before, maybe they're assuming that there is some big shining moment, but the reality is that it's all just, little shining moments throughout.
Yeah, and those are nice because even after you lose someone, those are still things you do all the time, maybe every week in the summer. And so you get to relive parts of those memories more often than maybe grand gestures that don't happen very often.
When you reflect on the day that Sami passed away, what were or are there emotions that you can kind of pick out that were the main things that you were experiencing or feeling during that day?
Loss is tough because I remember the day Sami died very clearly, and then I don't remember most of the rest of the year. So I think my memory has a pretty solid trauma lock in place. I have flashes of things, maybe a general timeline, but there's tons of neighbors that I met that did very nice things for us that I don't know who they are at all. And I've met them since, and I'm totally confused. But the day we lost Sami, I remember in very sharp relief. I remember driving to the hospital and seeing an ambulance and wondering if that was him. I think I didn't realize that he was going to be gone when I got to the hospital because my friend was just texting me that the ambulance was coming, that he wasn't breathing, but I know people get resuscitated all the time.
Yeah.
But he must have had some sort of arrhythmia because his heart stopped and they just couldn't get it going again. And so that's eventually why he stopped breathing. But it wasn't SIDS. He was fully awake. No one really knows what happens. There's no structural issue with his heart that could have been seen. My husband's a baby doctor. We had a stethoscope hanging on the back of Sami's door. We were like helicopter parents in chief. Nothing anyone could have done or known about. I remember going to the emergency room and walking in and saying I was looking for my son, and the security guard was incredibly unhelpful. And a police officer walked up, and I asked if he was coming from my friend's house, if he knew where my son was, and he started talking to the security guard, and they were both ignoring me, which was horrible.
Horrible.
On a number of levels, until the hospital chaplain came up and got me and brought me back when they were doing CPR. My husband was there, and as soon as I saw my husband, I was concerned, obviously, but I genuinely thought things would be fine until I saw my husband in his scrubs from working upstairs, and I knew. But it's violent. Like, CPR is violent. It's awful. It's a really traumatic thing to see, even if it's not your child.
Yeah.
That I think a lot of people, thankfully, never have to witness. I don't know, when Damar Hamlin, the Buffalo Bills player, collapsed on the field about a month ago at a Cincinnati Bengals game. So I had a lot of friends there, and a lot of folks were posting on social media about the trauma of watching that unexpectedly happen in a stadium. And it brought back a lot of memories to the day Sami died, because like, it's a horrible thing to witness, even when it's someone you don't know and you're around like tens of thousands of other people. So on a small scale, it's just gutting, right? So it's horrible. You're just in a state of shock and disbelief. I remember who was sensitive to us. I remember who wasn't. Luckily, we're at a really fantastic hospital, so at least you have the comfort of knowing everyone's done everything they can, so there's no sort of regret around that. I have friends that have really strong and justified suspicions about medical malpractice about the loss of their children, and I think having to live with that is probably a very unique hell. And so there's not really a hierarchy of grief, right? It sucks regardless when your kid's dead, but I think there are some worse circumstances than others. So to know that he didn't suffer, that there was nothing anyone could have done, that everyone did everything they can, brings you a little bit of peace in hindsight. But it's a weird feeling knowing that you're living the worst day of your life and that no other day could possibly be worse than this.
Right.
And it's really surreal.
Yeah, I was going to ask, does it bring you peace, or what does it bring you that there's no way that it could have been prevented? And you kind of already answered that. But yeah, I'm just maybe more curious about not how you make sense of it, because there's no sense to be made of it, but kind of how you conceptualize it, I guess, or how you relate to the fact that there was nothing to be done.
Yeah, I think the way you've just phrased that is really sensitive, right? Because a lot of people will, I don't know, give you all the sorts of platitudes that people say when someone dies that are really insensitive. And they feel especially insensitive when your kid has died, right? And when there's never any rhyme or reason to it, but especially when it's so shocking and out of the blue. Because there's no sense to be made out of something so completely senseless, right? How do you make meaning out of something where, like, there's no reason that should have ever happened?
Yeah.
So I think it's actually really interesting to think through grief and trauma and a loss like this through the lens of CMM, and particularly for our drive to make meaning.
Yeah.
Like, how do you make sense of the senseless? What narrative can we recreate that helps us abandon the desire to try to make sense out of it, right? Because it's fundamentally nonsensical. And if we are always striving for sense making and meaning making,
Yeah.
we're incredibly unmoored when that doesn't exist.
Right.
And I think for some people, maybe it does, and that's great, right? I remember my husband and I sitting there being like, I wish we were religious, because I think
you'd have like a framework
really right now. Yeah. Not that religious people aren't also tormented when they lose a child, right? But I think there's maybe a sense of comfort there that we don't necessarily have. So I don't have any sort of higher power to look toward for meaning making. And the thought of something so completely life destroying just happening randomly and for absolutely no reason really makes you feel it's terrifying.
Yeah, right.
You're unmoored. Like, there's no governing logic to life, and no one deserves it. It should never happen to anyone. But like, my husband is a baby doctor at one of the best hospitals in the world. How could it happen to us? Right. But fate or luck or genetics or whatever it is don't discriminate, I guess. So I can see why people would be desperate to try to make sense out of it, to try to explain it, to try to find meaning in it, or find some silver lining, right? At least comments.
Yeah, anything that starts with at least, not helpful.
Yeah, but I think I resist all of that, right? It is what it is, and it's bad, and that's really all there is to it.
Yeah, and you're saying no need to put a silver lining around the conclusion of it's bad.
Yeah, there's nothing that has come about after Sami's loss that justifies a loss of that magnitude, that makes it worth it, that dulls the ache of it.
Yeah, I think that's a great perspective, because I do talk a lot and think a lot about the meaning we're making, and what I haven't thought about as much as is, what if there's no meaning to be made of things? And I think that's just as important a part of the story, kind of that same side of that coin. Do you feel like I don't know exactly what language you'd use, but, maybe the piece that you have around not being able to make meaning out of this situation, does that allow you to feel more at ease when there's not meaning to be made in other areas of your life?
Yeah, and I think it lends itself to like a really radical form of grace and compassion we can extend to other people as well. Like, horrible shit happens to people all of the time for no reason, not because they did anything wrong. And even if they did, like, that doesn't mean they deserve horrible shit to happen to them. Yeah. Because lots of people do stuff that's wrong all the time, and terrible things don't happen. But we have to act with grace and compassion and a little less blame where we can, and try to just find more genuine empathy for each other. We can't always fix our problems. We just need to figure out how to live with them and help other people live with them too.
What has your kind of overall experience with grief been?
I think all the grief you experience, apart from something like this, feels pretty manageable. So I don't know, had a pretty insulated bubble life. Like, both of my parents are alive. One of my best friends died during grad school, and that was horribly asynchronous and painful, but they were chronically ill. So it was really, felt out of the blue at the time, but didn't feel totally out of the realm of possibility. But like, lost my grandmother when I was pregnant with Sami, who's the matriarch of our family, and that was difficult, but she was old and lived a good life. And so you have that to sort of ground yourself in. It's sad and you miss them, and it's disruptive to your family. And it's hard to watch your parents go through losing their parents. I lost my other grandmother when I was younger, but like, those losses happen in the order that they're supposed to in some way. We wish people would have had more time, but I think it's very different when you lose a child and experience that very unique form of grief, because there's no reason that should ever happen, right? I think something funny about grief is that it can grant some perspective where, I think about how so many of my lows became my highs. So pandemic baby becomes like this gift of nonstop family time together. A baby that doesn't sleep at night gives you all these extra hours together. I don't want to make light of any of those circumstances or say they weren't difficult. Obviously, the stress of the pandemic, especially with a spouse who's a doctor in hospital, and the inability of extended family. Our family's all around the world. My husband's from Jordan. We have family all over the place that never got to meet Sami because everyone's countries were on lockdown. It wasn't safe to travel. Usually, the bad isn't all bad. I think about when I broke my elbow when Sami was 3 months old and couldn't pick him up. Oh. And my husband was on service working 12-hour days at the hospital. So my parents had to move in with me. I couldn't even go to the hospital because I couldn't drive myself. We couldn't take the baby to an emergency room in a pandemic. Mm-hmm. So I had to call my parents and wait till they drove in from out of state and go to the hospital the next morning.
Oh my God.
My elbow. But my parents had like 3 or 4 uninterrupted weeks taking care of my baby. Mm. And I think most of their core memories with Sami are from that period, right? So you're like, oh man, why is breaking my elbow a life highlight?
Right.
It feels low, right? I was just in tears that I couldn't pick up my own baby, that my parents had to uproot their lives. Like, you feel like a mess at the time. And then in hindsight, you're like, well, I don't really want to be a everything happens for a reason person, but there is some perspective to be granted for things like that. I'm a lot more open to ascribing higher level meaning to good things than to bad things.
Yeah.
And then I'll just let bad things sit where they are. But I think the only truly bad thing with no redemptive good is the loss itself, right? There's no silver lining to your kid dying. I'd trade every ounce of perspective, every new connection I've made, every act of altruism or outreach for 1 more minute with my kid. Mm-hmm. So there's no growing or being better. I think in a lot of ways, I'm actually way less empathetic in a lot of ways. Like, I'll read the most tragic book and I'm like, not as bad as your kid dying, but okay. Yeah. So I consciously know that grief and loss and tragedy are a competition, but sometimes you just can't help it. You're like, it is. You'll be fine.
Yeah. Well, here's what I'm hearing in you talking is that I think you're adding like a really important nuance that a lot of people maybe miss when they're talking about grief, is that you are saying this loss happened and now I am more empathetic, less empathetic, whatever, I have perspective. I've experienced all these good things. When I look back, I see this beautifulness, whatever. But you're not saying any of that justifies the loss.
No.
And I think that's what you're saying about those like at least comments. Well, where at least your parents had time, at least you had some, at least blah, 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 whatever, I think you're hitting on this more artful way of talking about what you're saying, those good moments that you look back and see, or moments that you originally thought were not great, the getting up in the middle of the night, the breaking the elbow, whatever. But now you can look back and put some meaning to those, and yet it doesn't justify the loss. And I think that's, you adding a little complexity to the situation and being able to sit in that complexity of both. It's what I call like a both and, like both of these things are true at the same time. They don't negate each other, and one, like you're saying, does not justify the other.
Yeah. One of my online grief friends who I've connected with around child loss has this poem where she says, I can limp with grief and dance with joy all at once. I don't have to choose. Katie Jameson. And so I think that's really powerful, right? That sort of sentiment that it's okay. Like there's no coming back from this, right? You're always fundamentally going to be broken in a lot of ways. It doesn't mean you won't feel joy again. It does mean that will probably be tarnished in a lot of ways forever, but it doesn't delegitimize the happiness you feel, and the happiness you feel doesn't legitimize the grief you also feel at the same time.
Yeah, I think it's, very deeply human thing to be existing in grief, sadness, loss, whatever
at the same time as joy and happiness and beautiful things. How have you navigated? How do you understand experiencing, I imagine, all of those emotions at the same time?
It's overwhelming. And I think it's never more overwhelming than when I had my daughter, Salma, because it's so much of the same, right? And it's hard not to compare those experiences, but you don't want to project that onto her either, right? Mm-hmm. We're always just like, how do we not like vicariously traumatize this child who will always have this trauma that she didn't experience firsthand as part of her life story, but she'll also, grow up without a brother.
Yeah.
That eventually she'll realize should be here. And I think that's the toughest part for me lately, is it feels like we're not just missing out on something. Sami's not just missing out on something, a lot of some things, but so is Salma. Mm-hmm. And that's really tough. But I think, I don't know, to let it destroy you, not that it's always a conscious choice, does a disservice to Sami. Like if I don't want Sami to be the reason that my life implodes or my marriage implodes or that his sister doesn't feel joy in her household growing up, right? That's right. I think like that's not what he would have wanted is a really ineffective way to express that. But when you are expecting to parent someone for their full life and then they're gone, I think parenting looks like steering a legacy they didn't get to build. And to make that legacy negative does a real disservice.
Yeah.
And so I would never want anything horrible to happen as a result of Sami, whether it's his life or his loss. So I think that guides us a lot.
If you are thinking about it in terms of stories, what is the story that you had about grief prior to experiencing the loss of Sami? Like when you went through that grief, did you have kind of a model of grief in your head around this at all? Were you going from scratch? Were you saying my experience is not matching with what I'm hearing from other people? What was that like for you?
It's tough. There's no grief groups meeting in person when we lost Sami. We didn't have a funeral. Like people couldn't convene. There's no in-person grief groups we could join. Some people recommended some social media and Facebook groups for people who have experienced child loss, and I've heard those can be really helpful for some people, but they just weren't resonating with the way I was grieving at all, and weren't what I needed to see. I was like, I don't mean this judgmentally at all, because I get how this happens, especially if you're under-resourced in a lot of ways. But I was like, these people are a mess. And I don't want to see that like 10 years from now, I'm still going to be a mess. I need to see that like I will be able to bear it.
Right.
And so I think that's what I needed to see, not in a glossy, you get over it way, but you can feel joy and learn to carry it sort of way. Which I think I was able to do because we had the personal wealth to get private therapy from someone who was a good fit for us. We could like do whatever made us feel better. I bought a puppy. I bought a treadmill. Like whatever we needed to do to get us through. We had unending family support from both sides of our families in ways that were gentle and empathetic, and for the most part, what we really needed. Right. And so I think I had a spouse who I'm close to, and we happen to process grief similarly in a lot of ways. So I think if you didn't have any of those things, I can see why you would really spiral in a way that you can't come back from. I think there's no way to even wrap your head around it. People say it all the time, I can't even imagine. And it's like, yeah, you can't. I'm glad you can. But it's definitely the sentiment I get most often. And I think there's a lot of self-awareness in saying that. Some people will say, I mean, you could imagine, you just don't want to.
Yep.
Which is also a fair stance. But you never really feel it until you feel it. I'm glad most people don't. I think there's a reason I tend to gravitate toward people who have also experienced a lot of grief and loss and disruption in their lives now, because it's hard to relate to people who haven't on a deep personal level. I joke with like a couple good friends of mine that I've made since Sami's passed that we're all cursed. We must have like angered a sea witch in a past life or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
Just like unlucky people who are a lightning rod for tragedy. For seemingly no reason.
I mean, another way of trying to make meaning when there's no logical, medical, whatever meaning, might as well be a sea witch cursing you. Why not?
I told you I've gotten superstitious.
When that becomes the most logical explanation, then yeah, you really...
How do we make sense of the senseless? Something has to be going on.
That is where we are going to end the first part of our conversation with Michelle, but we do have more to hear from her. You can join us again next week to hear even more wonderful perspective from Michelle. A lot of that conversation is going to be about her insight into what felt helpful from people and what did not. So even if child loss is not something that you have personally experienced, I think there's a lot of value to be taken from Michelle's story for all of us who are trying to love our people well, including when there is deep grief in our lives. We want to be able to lean in. We want to be able to show up for each other, but how is the question, right? I think it's worth having a conversation about and learning about. So I hope you'll join us for that. As always, I get to do this podcast with support from the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. We share the same goals of reflecting on our communication, learning the power of storytelling, and working to make better social worlds. They're doing these things in a number of ways. You can read about them on my website under the CMM Institute page, and also check out their website to see what else they have going on that you might want to be a part of. It's a really great community over there and has been really welcoming to me, and they are some of the best people I know for sure. Please take the time to share this episode with someone who it might be meaningful for, someone who you thought of during this conversation, or someone you want to continue this conversation with. You can also follow the show wherever you listen so you never miss an episode. Find me on Instagram at Stories Live Stories Told Pod. Find me on YouTube for some extra educational content at Stories Live Stories Told, and check out my website, storieslivestorietold.com. All of this I will link in the description. And please use any of those platforms to reach out. I love to hear what this podcast means to you. So thank you in advance for sharing that and taking the time to do that for me. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious. And thank you for being a part of this story. Keep creating mindful moments. And until next time, I'm Abby, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.